Hi there, and welcome to the Cotswold Explorer. I'm Robin Shuckburgh, and we're exploring the wonderful region of the Cotswolds in southwest England. We decided to revisit the centre of the region and find some hidden gems, places that are not quite so famous, but still just as beautiful. And today you find Ross, Widget, Gizmo and me in a little village called Wiggington. It's really rather surprising, this little village. It's not quite as small as it was expected it to be. It's got a very important little church. And of course, we're in that wonderful countryside where the stone is of a much deeper red colour than we are used to in the normal Cotswolds. Come with us, we're going to show you around. A short ride up the homely green valley from South Newington, where you found us last week, brings us to the little village of Wiggington. Those of you who were with us last week will remember that we saw a church in South Newington, which was not only unspoiled, but full of old wall paintings, rediscovered and restored in the 20th century. Clearly, this was a region less persecuted by the reformers than many, for Wiggington also has a very unspoiled church. It is modest and unpretentious, but is one of the most beautiful and, save for the added perpendicular clerestory, one of the most unaltered examples of the early English style in this part of the country, stemming from around 1180 to 1275. There is a peculiar charm in the clustered columns, deep mouldings and high-pitched roofs of this particular style, and the scene that meets the eye as you enter through the porch, curiously placed at the northwest angle of the building, is wholly delightful. In a country church, where you can generally take in everything at a glance, the first impression on entering counts for much. You're at once either cheered or depressed, and at Wiggington there is no question which. For those interested in such things, there are, rather unusually, two low side windows in this church. Originally unglazed, they were closed with wooden shutters. One of them is right next to the beautiful stone priest's seat, about which a little more in a minute, and as you can see, now glazed along with the rest of the window. Obviously their use was to communicate with the churchyard outside, but what this communication was can only be a matter for conjecture. Probably they served more purposes than one. For instance, in the absence of a sanctus belcut, the bell might be rung through them by an acolyte, or they might have been utilised in connection with the funeral service. The idea that they were used to administer the sacrament to lepers requires confirmation. The aforementioned stone priest's chair is in an unusual spot against the southwest wall and might have been moved at some point. It's beautiful, with an elaborate canopy, with its hoodstops carved as a swan and a dragon. It's surprisingly comfortable. On the north side of the chancel arch, the rude loft stairway is still visible, and there are two medieval monuments in the chancel in arched recesses, which have been obscured a bit by the raising of the chancel floor and the insertion of benches. The recumbent knight, now on the north side, was originally lying on a black marble gravestone on the south side, and a stone coffin with a cross on it, clearly described by Rawlinson as on the north side, has seemingly been destroyed. The effigy of a recumbent man with two small female figures, one on either side, now in the southern recess, in the early 18th century was fixed to the outside of the south aisle. His two small companions were almost certainly also designed to be standing in recesses in a wall, and don't represent his children or wives, as sometimes suggested. There's no mention in Evans of the stained glass east window, which surprised me a little until I discovered that it was designed and installed by one L. Moore of London in 1909, a few years after Evans passed through. I'm very much afraid he probably wouldn't have approved. The church has 3 bells, recast in the 18th century, with a mid-17th century clock designed to strike the hours on the tenor bell, which my books tell me has been out of action since the 1920s. But I'm absolutely certain that while we were there, I listened to the tick-tock of the clock and even heard a strike. Now I'll have to go back and find out if I was imagining things. Or perhaps one of our kind listeners, who I happen to know lives in Wiggington, might just drop us a note to put us right. Travelling the lanes of this village, you can see its atmosphere has altered very little over the years. It took its name from the Saxon Lord Wicga, spelt W-I-C-G-A, who seems to have owned a lot of property in the area. But this valley had already attracted Romano-British settlers, as demonstrated by the Roman villa of some size and wealth, discovered to lie just northeast of the church. It was excavated in 1824 by the curate with the help of Joseph Skelton, who described it in his Antiquities. More excavations were carried out in the 1960s. Originally, the centre of the village was probably more closely centred around the church. Indeed, we know that several cottages, dilapidated at the time, were bought and given to the church in 1867 by one J.R. Cobb and demolished to extend the churchyard. The well you can see in the lane opposite the church used to be in a cottage garden. What houses you see today were built mostly in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, although extended and altered much more recently. Originally with thatched roofs, giving regular work to the 2 thatchers who lived in the village. Stonesfield slate and other types of roofs have replaced much of the thatch in recent times. At its peak in 1861, the village had around 338 inhabitants. I'm not certain how many people live here today, but in the late 20th century, the population had fallen again to 159. I guess we all have smaller families these days. I hope you've enjoyed our little trip around Wiggington. It's a pretty place in the folds of the hills with this extraordinary coloured stone, and the churchyard, which is rather wonderful. It's mown in places, but as you see behind me, some of it is left pretty wild. I suspect this is on purpose in order to improve biodiversity. A very, of course, topical thing these days. I've liked it, yes, it's been very nice. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You can find us on all the normal platforms, of course, and we will see you again very soon somewhere else in the Cotswolds.